Good afternoon, everyone. Come on in, come on in. Welcome to another webinar organized and hosted by the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and the American Association for Public Broadband. As the young people say, we've got another banger lined up with a really good and timely focus. Today, we examine providing internet service in MDUs, apartment buildings, condo complexes, mobile home parks. We are excited to have some real experts with us today who are tackling these challenges every day. I'm Sean Gonsalve, Associate Director for Communications, Senior Writer with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance Community Broadband Networks Initiative. And as always, I'm joined by our co-host and connectivity champion, Gigi Song. How you doing, Gigi?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here again, and amazing how excited people are to hear about connectivity in multi-dwelling units, or MDUs for short. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before we start. So today's session is being recorded, and we'll share the replay afterward. Please drop questions and comments in the chat throughout the webinar, and we'll have time for Q&A towards the end, about 10-15 minutes. So let's start and frame the conversation about why this matters. When communities plan broadband expansion, it's natural to think street by street or neighborhood by neighborhood. But if you want universal access, we have to really shift the lens. If you want to connect a community, we can't just think street by street. We have to think floor by floor, building by building. Apartment complexes, public housing, condos, and mobile home parks contain some of the largest concentration of unserved and underserved households in this country. These buildings should be cost efficient to serve, but unfortunately, in reality, they often present some of the toughest barriers, from wiring challenges and access restrictions to exclusive provider agreements, even though technically they're supposed to be illegal, and outdated policies. At the same time, getting this right represents one of the fastest ways to make a meaningful progress on digital equity. So today, we're focusing on what it really takes to serve multi-dwelling units, again, MDUs, the technical realities, policy barriers, business models, and the practical solutions emerging from communities doing this work on the ground. With that, let's dive in, and I'm going to turn it back over to Sean to introduce our first guest.
All right. Well, let me start by telling you all about DigitalC. DigitalC is a nonprofit technology social enterprise based in Cleveland, Ohio. It's headquartered in Cleveland's Midtown Tech Hive. Not only has the organization been driving digital skills training across the city, it has built and launched Canopy, a citywide, high-capacity fixed wireless network delivering broadband to over 8,700 households in the city of Cleveland for as low as $18 a month. The quest to build, to bridge the digital divide in Cleveland is really an ongoing challenge, but they have achieved so much success that they're now launching a similar effort in Detroit, Michigan. Using Tirana and incoax to serve residential households, which includes a good number of multi-dwelling units, DigitalC is led by my guy and NBA fan rival, Joshua Edmonds. Let's welcome Joshua to the program. What's happening, Josh?
A whole lot. And I mean, are we rivals at this point?
He's a Cavaliers fan. I'm a Warriors fan, so maybe we're not rivals anymore. We're kind of out of the playoff picture, but you know. But no. So we're excited. We're excited to have you, folks that have been in and around our events, been around GG at different conferences, should be pretty familiar with you. And we wanted to have you particularly because as we focus on multi-dwelling units, the work that you're doing in Cleveland and now in Detroit, I think can be real instructive for our audience. So I want to kind of like dive right in. And as we kind of want to paint a picture of why MDUs matter, I think I want to start by asking you, okay, maybe that's
Why don't I pick it up, Sean, and you can figure out your technical difficulties. So, Josh, when cities think about digital equity, why should MDUs be near the top of the list? And what makes apartment buildings and public housing in particular such a strategic opportunity?
Yeah, so again, thank you all for having me. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I'm a proud board member of AAPB. So it's always great to see you, Gigi, in multiple capacities. But when we think about digital equity strategies, it's MDUs aren't really optional, though in many cases they've been presented that way. They're more so foundational. And the reason why we say they're foundational is because when we're looking at whether we're doing training, doing deployments, like the MDU is the center point to so many different leverage points in the broader digital equity strategy. So not only are you going to have a captive audience of residents who are just all compiled in the same place, so you can move significantly faster than going down an entire street, getting all these single family housing agreements. You have an amalgamation of residents right in front of you. You have seniors, we have families, we have every use case imaginable right there on the people side. Politically, these are the places that if you're going campaigning, you're going to campaign in these apartment buildings. So there's political will entrenched within MDUs. In addition to that, you also have the opportunity, especially for us as a fixed wireless company primarily, those rooftops are invaluable. And so strategically, as we're thinking about deployment measures, not only do the rooftops matter to us, but the people and the floors, like everything about an MDU is absolutely foundational for digital equity and for any organization that will be prioritizing expansion at scale. And I think that the reason why MDUs oftentimes are left out is because there's a harder people component here. We've always seen great strategies are being developed for cities, but then the reality hits the road and the relationships aren't built. And so if you don't have the relationships with these property managers or with the residents within that, or if the trust isn't present, it's going to be very hard for you to move with an actual digital equity strategy, and more so something that is addressing symptoms of the digital divide.
Well, I think that plays very nicely into my next question, which is, what are the practical barriers that you see? I mean, are the landlords the problem? Is it, incumbent exclusive control, legal constraints, physical access? What is it? What are the things that really make it this a more difficult market than maybe otherwise people would think?
Definitely. I mean, all of those that you mentioned, absolutely. Wiring, sometimes the supply clauses can be locked, and one team might be working on deploying a solution, but there's another team there, and you have to balance out different provider technologies. But even taking it one step further, if you're going after, especially in the urban core, you're going to run into residents who are dealing with a number of issues, and that's you're going to find that everywhere. But if you're going into specifically public housing, where there's a number of MDUs there, a lot of opportunity, you might find grant funding for that type of work. But you're also going to be running into people who have mental health challenges too, who are going to see the wiring that your team is doing, and they're going to rip the wires out the wall. They're going to tear things up. I mean, that is a reality of the situation. Some of these buildings might be older, and they could be flooding your telco spaces. I mean, there are a number of challenges that you're going to see in these spaces that require, I would say, an allocation of grace when you're doing these projects. If you don't have that, and if you're looking for cash to be your primary return of investment, specifically in these urban cores, you're valuing the opportunity the wrong way. Showing up and prioritizing digital equity at the center with an emphasis on that equity word, it's going to allow you to maybe move in ways that a for-profit entity might not. As a nonprofit, we give more grace. We look at mental health as something that if someone is having an episode in the hallway thinking we're spying on them, that is a reality of servicing these MDUs that you need to think about it specifically within these urban cores.
And that's fascinating. I mean, so I think what you're saying in an urban core, you don't go in to wire an MDU just to make a buttload of money. You're doing it because you want everybody to get connected. I guess it's not to say, look, I know that there are folks that serve MDUs in wealthy areas that make a lot of money. But the kind of work that you're doing, you have a higher calling.
Absolutely.
I want to see if Sean, are you back on the track here?
I think so. Yeah, my mic was a little janky, I guess, but just sort of to wrap up this segment, I kind of wanted to focus on, and maybe you can mix in some of your own personal experience with DigitalC, some of the early days and kind of building out this network, or even some of the work that now that you're doing in Detroit again, because I know you were there working before. But for a city that's just starting out, what would you say is the first mistake to avoid?
The first thing, there's a lot of mistakes to avoid, for sure. And, you're really not going to get it right. There's always going to be a challenge in any of this stuff. But I would say the first one is falling in love with the technology more than the people. So oftentimes the technology, you can be sold a number of solutions that can promise gigabit speeds and promise so many bells and whistles that sound great. But if the technology outpaces your ability to build relationships with people who need it the most, well, then who cares? And so there is oftentimes a fallacy that we see in the broadband space broadly, the assumption that if we build these networks, we build the best high capacity networks, people are always going to use them. No, what you're going to find is most people believe that it's going to be too good to be true. It's going to be predatory in some cases, or if you have not built the relationships with the landlords and the property owners, then you're only going to go as far as those relationships. So if you don't have those relationships intact, or you don't have the knowledge of the people that you're willing to serve or you'd like to serve, i.e. if I'm going to a certain building, I know that it's better for me to offer the services or advertise them on the 1st of the month versus the 20th of the month. Like those are things where it's like, oh, people get paid, they get their, like there's so much nuance on the relationship side that, again, you're only going to go as far as your knowledge of the people within those buildings.
It sounds like the human network, that needs to be built is just as important, if not more important, at least initially, than the physical network in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
And speaking of which, Gigi, we should transition into some of the business and technical realities and invite one of our other guests to join us to do just that. Our next guest really has a long history in the telecom and broadband industry. For over 15 years, he worked for some of the largest ISPs in the nation: Frontier, CenturyLink, and Lumen. A few years ago, he went to work for the Minnesota-based QuickBit, which is an ISP that was focused on serving manufactured housing communities. And he learned a lot from his time there, mostly the mistakes they were making, which, as he told us in a recent podcast of ours that he was on, he put on his entrepreneur pants and launched his own company, REVInternet, to address the challenges of serving manufactured housing communities and mobile home parks. So let's welcome REVInternet founder and CEO, Brendan Kelly.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
All right. How are you, Brendan? Gigi, why don't you kick us off here in getting into Brendan's mind?
Yeah, Brendan, thank you so much for being here today. So I want to ask the first question. So you're particularly interested in serving mobile home parks, which again, when I think of MDU, it doesn't even enter my mind. So this is just fascinating to me. So from a network operator's perspective, what makes multifamily housing different from single family neighborhoods? And what are the most common technical obstacles? Again, old wiring, lack of conduit, locked telecom closets. What kind of comes up in the technical sphere that really are the biggest obstacles?
Yeah, you hit a lot right there, and Josh did as well. There's more simplicity, I think, at the end of the day than complexity, but there is complexity. The simplicity, of course, you're an ISP deploying to a new subdivision, and it's going to take you quite a bit of time and capital to bring internet to 30 homes, where if you go to an MDU, now you have 300. So the cost per passing is obviously a lot cheaper. The deployment should be easier and quicker, but everything's unique. With an MDU, basically, I find the biggest obstacle is just the various parties. You're not dealing with, the Joneses at 123 Main Street. You have to deal with the owner of the building, the leasing manager, and the residents themselves. So HOAs, there's just a lot of layers to get through. And I think that I find more often than not, that's what kind of precludes a lot of deployment in MDUs, is just all Oh, well, frankly, it's the red tape and layers. But if he could push through that, the reward is, it's there.
Let's talk about like one of the elephants in the room when it comes to serving MDUs, I think, which is bulk billing. In many apartment communities, internet service is provided through bulk billing, or managed Wi-Fi arrangements where it's like included in the rent, or it's charged as an amenity or a technology fee that's disclosed, or maybe not in some cases during the leasing process. And like that model has some benefits, right? They reduce common subscriber barriers like upfront costs for equipment and credit checks and security deposits, and it can provide like a lower overall cost through scale that you were just talking about. I think they can be really helpful in senior housing and in student housing, but I learned that under previous programs like the Affordable Connectivity Program, that renters that were in bulk billed communities were often deemed ineligible for ACP benefits because they didn't receive a separate retail internet bill. And so as a result, households that are arguably needed the most assistance would be excluded in those instances. So I guess my question to you is, when is bulk billing a good tool, and when does it become a problem?
Well, I would say it's a good tool, kind of what I was speaking about earlier, the simplicity of it all. I'm speaking to the choir here, but broadband should be considered in the same breath as, gas and electric. It's a utility, and to have your utilities bundled as a resident certainly is, for ease. And in a lot of cases with bulk billing, your internet could be set up even before you move into the apartment. It's just good to go. The router's already there, and really just a quick phone call and you're live again. So you're not waiting for a technician and all that stuff. So that's great. Where it gets difficult, again, it's kind of that people side of it. One of the advantages for an owner is obviously increased net operating income. And, there's nothing wrong with that. But I've learned through my experience that there's a natural hesitancy and fear, frankly, within the manufactured housing community. And that's a whole nother, political discussion right there. But from that is, what are you making out of this? How much is the owner making? So are they really getting the best deal possible? And any consumer feels that they could do better on their own, which may or may not be the case. So again, there's just kind of a natural wariness about it. It's funny. If you look at any kind of Gartner quadrant of what people think of cable companies, they're in that most hated lower left quadrant until the cable company's gone, and then they love them. So, God forbid you take away my cable. Why do I have to have this? I was so much happier with the other brand, even though just the month prior they were on the phone complaining with them every day. I guess that's life. The other problem may be that if people are moving, transient populations, they might be migrating their service, and they could be locked into a contract. As such, even though contracts are, not too common nowadays, it could happen. So the resident is going to have that hesitancy. It's like, well, you're making me pay twice. So it's overall, I think it's a net good more than a net bad. But with everything else, there is no one's ever 100% happy, and I think anyone who owns an MDU realizes that. The best thing ISPs can do is to be empathetic to that ownership and that leasing agent, because broadband is important to us. It's not important to them. It is the lowest, in most cases, their lowest concern that they have to deal with. So as frictionless as you can make it, it kind of helps promote that win-win with all the parties.
Yeah, at the risk of looking like I'm defending bulk billing, because I see arguments on both sides. It's a very, very sticky issue. The fact that the ACP, which was a $30 subsidy for low-income households, doesn't apply, I think is the fault of the ACP, not necessarily the fault of bulk billing, and something that maybe Congress had seen in its wisdom to extend the ACP like it should have. They could have fixed that. So anyway, that's my commentary. But I want to ask a question, both Brendan, first to you and then to Josh. If you had to design the ideal building access policy, what would it include? So let's start with you, Brendan, and then go to Josh.
Sure. Real quickly on the ACP, I want to give credit where credit's due to the state of New Mexico for starting their own statewide ACP version. I hope a lot of other states follow suit and find a way to replace it. What I think would be ideal, well, one thing I'm researching and getting more and more enamored with is obviously AI. We're not an AI network that could benefit the resident, the building as a whole, and then, maybe other nearby buildings too. Really building neighborhood and community from that. And we're talking more than just like a smart speaker that can turn the lights on and off too. A self-contained proprietary network unique to each building, where one is a resident. AI will help, track that all those emails I wrote years ago and can't find anymore. But also, how do I benefit and build a community with my neighbors? Using the MHC example, I do small engine repair. 3 doors down, that person is a good baker. So to have that AI network that's proprietary and protected from the larger world, it's unique to that building, I think fosters a great community. So really, Sean, to your point about the human aspect of it, that's got to be our next stage. Bringing broadband is one thing, but how do we build community is the next, and that's what I would like to do.
Excellent. Josh?
Yeah, I would say from a building access standpoint, for us, we're still in markets in Cleveland. We haven't taken as much inventory of this in Detroit, but where there is still some exclusivity. But it's a unique way where I'm trying to show up, and it's like, oh, well, we have an agreement with so-and-so for the next 2 years, the next 3 years. I think from a residential advocacy standpoint, what do people want? I think that there's a lot of assumptions, and sometimes there's a bit of patriarchal approaches in broadband where we assume that we know better than, and just taking a better inventory of what people actually want, what people need. We offer an $18 100 symmetrical solution, and at 100 symmetrical, most people would tell us at the onset, well, I want 500, I want a gig, I want this, or I want that. And it's like, okay, but now that I'm seeing the usage relative to the price, I think that what we have is very competitive. And, part of this is educating stakeholders on, and by stakeholders, I mean residents in this case, of what the broadband landscape actually is, what people actually need, what people are actually using, and then using that as a baseline for people to then say, almost like a menu of options of what they want to see. Because as we're developing all these, new broadband models, even in wiring MDUs, whether leveraging positron and coax, a number of these, we figured out how to provide the services at very affordable rates and getting some incredible speeds. I think at this time, it's time to turn around to the residents in these spaces and say, what do you want? What do you need? And then we can structure this stuff a little bit better than what we're doing right now at scale.
Before we move on to the next segment, Josh, if I can, I just want to follow up, actually, Brendan, as well. Obviously fiber is the gold standard of internet connectivity, but there's some great, fixed wireless connectivity that can be had, and which you're very much involved in. But I guess my question is, from a building access standpoint of view, is it easier when with fixed wireless versus fiber, or not, or how do you think about stuff like that?
I think a lot has to depend upon the building itself. Where I am in the Twin Cities, and I'm sure a lot of cities in the suburb of Richfield, there's just lots and lots of MDUs built mid-century, the typical brick 3-story building that you can't get fiber into. So when my days at CenturyLink Lumen, we would be reaching out to the building and say, hey, can we wrap your building with fiber? And then we'll go through the window. They try and make it look as aesthetically pleasing as possible, but that was the only solution. And a lot of building owners just didn't want to have it. Then recently, and it's a brand name, I don't know what you would call it, but they started employing CASA. So you'd have fiber to the node and then push through that last, few hundred feet of copper and, easily get like 100 some meg up and down. So that was a good alternative. But overall, I think the big burden is the age of structure. But there's so many new apartments going up nowadays. I don't know if that's as bearing.
I'll only chime in and say something that should not be confrontational or like bad, but fiber, I do agree, it's the gold standard. Maybe fixed wireless is the platinum standard. And you can do what you want with that. And from an ease standpoint, easy depending on the variables that you're being driven by. If you're being driven by political will, for example, and you have to move fast, well, then you're going to have to prioritize what's going to be faster with respect to deployment. If you're going to be driven by, quality of service over time, well, then you're going to be. So I think it differs based on the motivations. But all in all, for us, we would, especially in these buildings, MDUs, we're going to prioritize the wired solution almost 12 times out of 10, specifically because we know longstanding what's going to hold up longer and the service quality, especially in some of these older bunker style MDUs.
Now let's move on to the next segment, and we're going to kind of zoom out to funding at the federal and state level. And it's my pleasure and honor to introduce somebody I've been able to work with in the past, Anna Read, who's a principal with HR&A Advisors, where she advises clients on broadband implementation strategies, program management, design, and compliance. Prior to joining HR&A, she was a broadband policy advisor for the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Capital Projects Fund, a $10 billion program focused on broadband infrastructure. In this role, she worked directly with states on program design, implementation, and compliance. And this, the CFP, or the ZPF, is one of those, I think, lesser known, but fantastically successful projects. Everybody talks about BEAD, but the CPF may land up in the end being even more successful. So Anna was key to that. And before Treasury, this is where I worked with her. She was a lead researcher for the Pew Charitable Trust's Broadband Access Initiative, which continues to do fantastic work. So let's bring Anna on, and I will start with the first question.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Gigi.
Great to see you. So at Treasury and in the States you've worked with, how are MDUs being addressed in broadband funding programs? And what current federal frameworks are helping or hindering MDU deployment?
Yeah, so with the Capital Projects Fund funding, several states decided to put a portion of their allocation towards MDU-focused programs. So New York's Affordable Housing Connectivity Program, Massachusetts has the Residential Retrofit Program, and Maryland has Homestretch Broadband for Public Housing Program. And I'd also note there are a couple other states that didn't put together MDU-specific programs, but did allow funding for MDUs in their competitive grant programs, including both Connecticut and Wisconsin. And these programs, combined with, to get into the sort of federal policy issue side, CPF funding, allowing states a little more flexibility in how they define the needs and the gaps in broadband access, states were able to put together programs to address this issue specifically and meet the requirements of the federal program as well. And so all of these programs have focused on in-unit connectivity, right? So as we've been discussing, in some form of affordable housing. In Maryland, the focus was initially on public housing, and then did expand to nonprofit-owned housing as well. Massachusetts has state-regulated and deed-restricted affordable housing, and New York has a slightly broader definition. And so kind of a range in how states approach that. And in terms of the federal policy or the policy issues kind of enabling or challenging this, I think one of the biggest challenges to putting funding towards these programs is how we define what is unserved, right? And so when we're looking at that definition of unserved and lacking access at 120, it's very much based on now the location. And MDUs will almost always show up as having service, right, on the map. Even if you don't have in-unit service, you have outdated wiring, you have outdated other issues that are preventing residents from having service at that speed. And so I think even as we're kind of looking towards speed, right, like it's not a deployment category, it's a non-deployment category. And we'll see, if that ends up being something where states are able to focus some of this infrastructure investment. And so I think as we're looking at kind of that policy challenge, that's one of the biggest ones, or has been one of the biggest ones over the last few years, being able to direct this funding that is available into these programs.
Yeah, I'll note that NTIA was boasting about zeroing out the District of Columbia because in their opinion, there were no unserved or underserved areas. And I can guarantee that in some of the low-cost housing, they are grossly underserved or unserved. So, yeah, I think that's the big problem, is that definition. So I'll turn it back over to Sean.
Yeah, I think one of the issues with MDUs, particularly in the Northeast, and I guess Cleveland isn't technically the Northeast, but that sort of Northeast sector, there's a lot of older buildings, a lot of older apartment buildings that have some real, wiring infrastructure issues that maybe isn't as much the case in, say, in California or Nevada. So in New York and Massachusetts, for example, I know that they established these retrofit programs where the state was giving grants to landlords or building owners to pay for the retrofit to solve some of these connectivity issues. I'm not sure if you necessarily work with New York and Massachusetts who have these programs, and frankly, admittedly, I don't know the recent details in terms of the success that they found with these programs. I think Nevada may have had something similar, but I guess I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about those kind of state programs that kind of address some of those older buildings, and if you think that there's something in Massachusetts and New York with these retrofit programs that other states should copy.
Yeah, so I think that first, to address the point about Nevada, they had initially planned to do a program with their CPF funding, and did not end up moving forward with that. So I think there's quite a lot out there about those plans. But as you mentioned, would definitely present a very different set of challenges, both in terms of kind of the ownership structure of affordable housing, as well as the age of the buildings. And as both Josh and Brendan have mentioned, I think one of the things with programs is kind of that technology component, right? And because you're looking at so many different types of properties, so many different configurations, different ages of buildings, different challenges in terms of how you can get into the building. Like when states are looking at these programs, I do think that is a big component, is not being overly prescriptive in the technology that needs to be provided, while at the same time, making sure you are prioritizing, that long-term investment with the federal or state funds that you are putting into those investments.
So other than the unserved, underserved issue that you mentioned before, are there any other policy blind spots that you see?
I think that there are a number, but I think one of the things, if we kind of take a step back and look at this issue, is it's both a broadband policy issue and a housing policy issue. And so we need to be thinking about it kind of holistically in terms of both of those areas, and not exclusively, in terms of broadband policy and what needs to be done.
Okay, that's great. I think now we're going to move to some crosstalk
Yeah.
and talk with everybody about what actually works. So
Yeah.
I'm going to kick this one off, Sean.
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right. If you could change one rule tomorrow to make MDU deployment easier, what would it be? And we'll go in order of speakers. So Josh, Brendan, and Anna.
I could change. Sorry, I think there's.
No, you're good.
All right. So if I could change one rule, and I know this is gonna sound bad with the anti-bulk billing stuff, but in some cases, especially where we're serving, the world around us is digitizing faster than people are catching up to it. And so, oftentimes when we're showing up, a payment portal is one of the biggest challenges for a lot of residents that we're facing, navigating that, especially given certain properties where we are. I would say that, I think we should be a little bit more sensitive to some populations that would benefit from someone actually handling the billing side of the equation. Specifically, we have this as a reality in Cleveland, where there's a certain property that was like, look, we would rather us just handle this. Interact with us, the building, don't even worry about the resident part. And so I just would ask, maybe in some cases, if we could maybe add a little bit more nuance to the bulk billing conversation for where it's applicable. Because we oftentimes get caught up in trying to facilitate billing for people where we're far from that. And that's actually, in some cases, what's keeping people offline in some of these properties.
Well, that's interesting. Okay, Brendan.
Very good question. And I'd probably second everything Josh just said. One thing an additional thing to make it easier. Well, I guess it's a personality issue for building owners to recognize that they themselves are in a bit of a service industry. They have people at the other end that are their residents. They have to be conscious of that. While increased NOI is important, it's not the be all end all. So recognize at the very end of the day, the ISP and the building are to help and take care of the resident, be respectful of their needs, and for an ISP just trying to get in the building, make it easier. Just let us do what we know what to do to help our mutual customer client. I guess that's a cultural thing, not so much.
Isn't it amazing if it's being nice and respectful of people and where they are is like such a big part of being successful. And and I can tell you it's often honored in the breach. So Anna, the one rule you can change.
Really hard to pinpoint one thing, but I think if you kind of look at like each different level, like echoing what Josh and Brendan have both said, right? And then taking it up to sort of the eligibility for funding piece and ensuring that these properties are defined as eligible for funding under various federal funding and, I think hopefully eventually state funding programs. And then, addressing those issues at the next level down of like the ISPs being able to get into the building and then, people being able to sign up for and make use of the service that is available in a way that's most effective for them.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Any other? Oh, Sean, you're next. You got it.
Yeah. Thank you. And we've talked a bit about bulk billing and the challenges and stuff that has. But I want to actually ask each of you, particularly, I think probably Josh and Anna, but Brendan, please weigh in as well. But it has to do because you would think there'd be some synergy between, for example, if cities are targeting, say, solving connectivity challenges, about coordinating with public housing agencies and whether broadband is treated as infrastructure or as an amenity. And so I think I've been a little surprised that cities and housing agencies, and I know housing agencies are often, operate independently of city government structure in a lot of ways, but I would love to hear you speak to that coordination and whether or not that's an area that's really right for better coordination.
Absolutely. I mean, my first role in broadband was actually working in public housing. And I think my third role was actually working in city government on broadband. And so I can tell you, based on working in both of those systems directly, that, if you don't have someone within your municipal government that is aiding in that coordination, what we're going to find are these multi-dwelling units have coverage, but might not have the connections. And if you don't understand that level of nuance between the two, oftentimes the cities are going to go on thinking as if, well, they're covered, but they're not connected. That but they're not connected part is not going to come to the surface of anyone's thinking. And that has been reflective of even how we invest in broadband in America. Especially you look at urban America right now, well, it's covered, but is it connected? And I think like that level again of nuance directly results in why the importance of coordination is so important, because if you're not going to think to that level, you wouldn't coordinate to that level either.
Anna, I'm interested to see if you've got anything to say about that, or Brendan.
Well, first, I think this is definitely through the funding programs that states do have being viewed as an infrastructure challenge and fundamentally an issue of getting infrastructure into these buildings and making, then that service available to the residents. In terms of, the coordination piece, these programs depend on having, pipeline of properties, which depends on having buy-in from property owners, which really relies on coordination with local housing agencies, with state housing agencies, with the entities that are working directly with, or in some cases directly managing those properties.
Brendan, I don't know if you have had anything that you'd like to add, and then I think Gigi may have one more question before we open it up to the audience Q&A. But
yeah, and I want to remind people, Brendan, before you go, I want to remind people to put their questions in the comments box, and we will ask them. So far, no questions, so think quickly. Go ahead, Brendan.
I guess this is more of a wish, but somehow can, perhaps government or ourselves as an organization really kind of heighten the need and the necessity of broadband and make it easier for MDU owners to be receptive to it. Because I can say, I think in most cases, broadband, they take it for, owners take it for granted. We bring a solution to a problem they don't know they have. But if there's some way that is better spelled out for them to really say, okay, I have to let the city into, if it's a muni network or a private network, it behooves me to get them into my building. I don't know how that's done, but boy, I'd like to see that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Somebody in the chat said it would be paramount for HUD to classify internet as a utility. In the Obama administration, HUD was very, very engaged with getting connectivity, and that just kind of ended with his administration. And it would be great for the next administration to pick that up again, because they were great partners when I was at the FCC on getting Section 8 housing connected. All right, I've got one more question for the three of you, and then we will go to audience Q&A, and we're starting to get some questions, so keep bringing them in. And Brendan, you can actually kind of start to allude to it. What role should public broadband networks play versus private ISPs? Anybody want to take that one?
So Gigi, in this case, so DigitalC, we are publicly funded.
Yes,
we're not. All right, we're in there. So in this case, I think that it actually is reflected in our service offerings. So yes, we offer internet access. We also offer training, and most people would think, rightfully so, that's at the residential level. But I think if you're going to be a publicly funded network for the benefit of the public, then it also requires us to educate the public funding institutions too, not only the importance of broadband, but the potential of broadband. Oftentimes this is on the side of, well, we need to get these residents who are on the wrong side of the digital divide over here on the right side, which absolutely, yes, we do need to do that. But at the same time, one of the big issues that we run into within these MDUs, and it's been talked on this call already, is like, if they're not really aware of like what's out there, what's the possibility, or what's the potential, and how we leverage this for greater whatever, well, then at the same time, all we're doing in many cases, we're leaving a lot of impact on the table. And so for us, I think that if you're a publicly funded network, so to speak, that should come with some type of education to the public institutions, your mayors, your politicians, or whomever, to come with us on this journey versus a means to an end of just connecting a building.
Do either of the other two have anything to add? If not, we'll move on to Q&A.
100%. I think the next evolution of both private and public networks is to foster inclusion and equity. That's what we have to work at now, even more so than access.
Anna, you have anything to add?
I think, in the absence of public networks in many places, right, these programs are funding private ISPs who do provide that connectivity. And so I think, there are different layers too, and different pieces of the challenge. And when you are kind of looking at the public network aspect and, communities are kind of planning for that, these are large sort of anchor tenants, right? And I think should be kind of considered that way as you're looking at those plans.
Great. So somebody named Kia Crandall, you had a really good question and it was accidentally deleted by one of our tech people. So if you wouldn't mind reposting it, that would be really awesome. So I'll ask.
We do have some great questions though in the queue here. So go ahead, Gigi.
Yeah, so I'm going to combine two of them. Somebody asked the question of the day is, might states be able to use BEAD non-deployment funding to solve for MDU issues? That's obviously everybody's waiting with bated breath for NTIA to come out with their guidance. And a similar question is, can you unpack the role of BEAD funding and other CPF funding and whether these will help or hurt? Also, what do the current administration's changes to BEAD mean for solving coverage? So if somebody wants to, Anna, I think you might be best suited for this to talk about, the role of BEAD non-deployment funding and just overall, can we apply this funding in a way that will connect MDUs?
Yeah, and I think as you mentioned, Gigi, it's kind of wait and see, right, with the non-deployment guidance. It is a use that's eligible in the notice of funding opportunity, and it is, again, an investment in infrastructure, and it is something that a number of states did prioritize in their BEAD initial proposals as a use for non-deployment funding. And so, if it is an eligible use and with the remaining funding that is available to states in non-deployment, it could be very impactful in addressing this issue. But that is a kind of a question that remains open at the moment. In terms of sort of the universe of federal funding, I think the CPF funding was a great way for states to be able to use some of this funding to advance these programs. And, because a few states, a handful of states have done some form of MDU program. There's a lot to be learned from that could be taken into, if states are able to address MDUs with their BEAD non-deployment funds. And so I think there's a lot of good learning from that could be incorporated into how other states think about and run their programs.
And is there any other funding? I guess the nice person who accidentally had their question was asking whether HUD had any funding at all that you know of.
No, there really has not been a lot of direct funding for broadband through HUD. There have been some programs that have aimed to address, expanding connectivity, Connect Home being obviously the notable one. So I think as, we're looking at kind of the funding opportunity, one thing I would say is that these programs don't necessarily take a huge amount of funding, right? Like the states that are doing them with CPF funding have put a good amount of funding into them, but, generally significantly less than into their last mile infrastructure programs. And they connect a lot of people. And so it is a place, and California actually has had a long time program their through the California Public Utility Commission, the Broadband for Public Housing account that is funded through the CPUC. And so I do think they are an opportunity for state funding or some smaller scale grant funded programs that are not reliant on federal funding.
Yeah, let me just say too, for the folks that are watching, who we've been saying CPF and the Capital Projects Fund a lot. That money is from the American Rescue Plan Act, and the rules around how you could spend that money on broadband were a lot more flexible than BEAD, which is BEAD is the program, the big program that everyone's talking about, was established through the infrastructure law that was passed. And as it relates to the non-deployment funds, yes, we're waiting with bated breath, because it would be nice if they just followed what Congress intended. Because if my reading of BEAD initially was that affordable housing anyway could be classified as community anchor institutions. And so the idea that Congress had was that, yes, some of those non-deployment funds, the leftover money, if you will, after you build new networks, could be used to connect public housing, affordable housing, and stuff like that. Now with this new administration, or not new anymore, but this administration has changed a lot of the rules, and now we're back to waiting on trying to figure out how the BEAD non-deployment funds can be used. We have I think we've got some other questions in the chat. Let's see here.
I've got one, Sean, if you want me to.
All right, good. Yeah, go ahead. Jump in there, please.
So this is for anybody. Do you have an example of how you worked with a local ISP to provide internet service to an affordable housing MDU? Josh, you're muted.
I was just saying, I mean, I feel like this is self-serving. I mean, we are that example in Cleveland and Detroit. I mean, we're servicing affordable housing MDUs. That's really our bread and butter, so to speak. Well, maybe less bread, but that's our butter, I guess, in the sense that we offer an $18 a month solution, and that is subsidized by way of the state of Ohio philanthropy here locally, as well as our American Rescue Plan grant that we were able to receive with the city of Cleveland. And so for us, we're prioritizing those places. If I was not in Cleveland, or if I was not doing this, the solicitation would still be, if I was acting outside of that, I would be making the case as an aggregation point of, hey, we have X amount of affordable housing properties within my city. And within this city, I'm already going to know, I'm going to assume a third of residents don't have access to the internet, based more not on the infrastructure itself, but more so just being priced out, and making that case to a variety of stakeholders. But DigitalC is an example, just to give it a plug, I guess, of a nonprofit ISP that is prioritizing nonprofit situations within affordable housing.
Anybody else have anything to add there? I mean, obviously Brendan also is his own ISP, but maybe Anna, in your work?
I have not been engaged working directly with the, at that level as much, but I do think, again, these three programs that we've talked about, as well as some of the others that are out there, have some really good examples, and I'd encourage everyone to look at their websites.
Yeah, I see a question here. I'd like to throw out there. And it comes from the state that I'm in, Massachusetts. Will at MAPC, great organization, asked an adoption question, not so much an infrastructure question, but he says that one adoption challenge that we've seen with MDUs in Massachusetts is that people, especially in senior housing, rely on bundled cable TV for news. Thoughts on how to help people switch from private ISP subscriptions? And that's a great question, especially in this era of streaming and what have you. But I'd be interested to hear that particular adoption challenge that you may come across with folks living in MDUs, particularly older Americans.
It's that's a huge issue in the MHC space and the MDU space. MHCs in particular, they tend to be a lot older, and quite frankly, 9 times out of 10, users just want to watch television. So if you don't offer, a good double play, you're definitely at a disadvantage. It goes. I keep dwelling on the human aspect. I'm sure a lot of us are used to talking people through how to hook up a Roku. They don't want to stream. So I think my, personal mission is, I want to break bundles. This is a great opportunity for people to be educated and learn how they can control each one of their channels, their phone, their video, and their internet separately, because at the end of the day, that's where they're going to find the value. But right now, it's just a huge hurdle. People want their TV. It's difficult.
There was one more. I know we have to wrap up soon, but there was an interesting question that I'm just going to ask from an HOA board member, owner in an MDU building. Can we service our entire building via HOA dues integration? That's an interesting. I don't know if anybody can answer that question, but I thought that was really interesting. Brendan?
No, I just gave it a thumbs up. That's a great idea. I don't foresee any problem with that. I'm going to use that. Thank you.
I would love to see that implemented. Similar to Brendan, thumbs up. I mean, I would love to see that. Would love to be integrated in a model like that. I haven't seen that done up close, but I don't think that there would be a reason why someone couldn't do that. I think oftentimes, again, this is just the understanding of the network side versus the financing side. But if you compare those together, however way you get it financed, absolutely yes.
Yeah. And I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but before we close out, I do want to mention, just because we've talked a bit about BEAD and the American Rescue Plan funding, and federal grant support is extremely important and extremely helpful. However, let's just not lose sight of the fact that cities fund infrastructure without federal grants all the time, and infrastructure projects that are way more expensive and complicated than broadband. Building a mile of road versus deploying a mile of fiber. I mean, the number, how much more expensive it is to do that for roads and other infrastructure, water systems, etc., compared to broadband, is a drop in the bucket. So I always like to remind folks that that BEAD and even the American Rescue Plan Act isn't the be all, the end all, that there are other funding and financial mechanisms that cities can look to potentially to address some of these issues. So I think it's important to say that.
Sean, I think you should take us out. We've got 2 minutes.
Well, I really like this conversation because as it relates to tackling some of these problems, again, the BEAD funding is directed mostly to rural communities, but there are cities, urban, suburban areas where there are pockets of people, particularly in MDUs, who are really underserved or unserved in many instances. And so it's great to hear from folks who are laser focused in a lot of ways on serving those particular communities. I'll just say that this program will be available on our YouTube channel immediately after this. So we'll be sending that out. If there are questions, please reach out to the American Association for Public Broadband or ILSR. But I do think that this discussion shows that these are technically solvable problems that really are about political will and folks addressing these issues. And so I'm hoping folks got some insight into that. And Gigi, you should also mention about American Association for Public Broadband, how folks can reach out and why cities should be joining organizations like that who are working on these challenges.
Yeah, that's kind of my job, right? So American Association for Public Broadband represents communities and network operators where communities control their infrastructure. And there's so many opportunities. As Sean said, there's ways to fund it without BEAD funding, although there are some public broadband networks that are getting BEAD funding. It was a struggle with this administration, but they got money. So we are a membership organization. We provide resources to those communities that want to build or thinking about building. And we are just really excited to be partnering with ILSR on these webinars. So I hope you'll join us, aapb.us. And I can be reached at gsohn@aapb.us if you have any questions. And I'm thinking we may do a follow-up to this one because A, it was really popular, and B, I think, you know, we poked a lot of bears, and I think we could have an even further conversation about how to serve multi-dwelling units.
That's right. And thank you very much to all of our guests, Anna Read, Joshua Edmonds, Brendan Kelly. You were terrific. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you guys in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you.